Wichita. Wichita, Kansas. As in, not Wichita Falls. The small town that thinks itself bigger than its britches. The city that has a big heart and even bigger secrets hidden in its gutters. And it's my job to drag those dark, seedy secrets into the light that is Wichita justice. If only it paid me anything. But such is the life of a private detective. Could it be a client? Ha! Not with my luck. More likely it was trouble knocking at my door.
What? I couldn't hear you. Can I come in or not?
Oh, of course. Sorry, I was just monologuing there. Who might you be?
Me? Who am I? I am the darkness, poured into the form of man. I am malevolence, made into flesh, that is hung on the bones of malice itself. Animated by illness and plague, cloaked in despair, I am evil!
Animated by illness and plague, cloaked in despair. Okay. Would that be with one L or two?
What?
How many L's would be in your name?
What name?
Your name.
I'm evil!
You already said that. Would that be with one L or two?
My name isn't evil, I am evil. Evil incarnate.
Please, I know Evil Incarnate. I send her my alimony check every month. Now, are you going to tell me your name or not?
Yeah? It's progressive. Malevolent progressive.
Malevolent Progressive.
Actually, it's malevolent progressivism, but that's too long to fill on the text forms, so...
Okay, Malevolent Progressive. What can I help you with?
Well, your name is Codename D, right?
Yes,
And you are the Undercover Progressive, right?
that's what I had the man stencil on my door. Now, why are you here?
I am here to recruit soulless minions to go forth and carry my dark design upon the face of the earth, to destroy all that is good and holy.
Okay, whatever. My rate is $150 a day, plus expenses. And in your case, I think I'll need to charge a weirdness fee.
Did you hear the soulless part, right?
Rest assured, my ex-wife destroyed any soul I might have had years ago.
My plan. Got that, right? Destroy all that is good and holy?
Shouldn't be that hard in a town like this, with all the potholes, seedy joints, cheap hotels. Pick up a little garbage here and there, and...
Serious. I don't think you understand what you're getting into. I really am evil incarnate.
Well, can you prove you are evil? Progressive?
Really? You don't know who I am?
Do you have any ID?
Ricarding. I'm older than sin itself, and Ricarding.
Well, it's not about how old you are, it's whether you're evil. Your name could be Sunbeam, for all I know.
My name is not Sunbeam. Oh, alright. I'll show you my, oh darn.
Let me guess.
It appears I left it in my other cloak in spare when I left it at the dry cleaners.
Then I'm afraid it can't take up your case.
Wait. What if I give you a reference? Would that work?
Maybe, depending on the reference.
Well, there's this guy, Sargon of Akkad. He will attest to how evil I am. Here, have a listen.
In modern politics, particularly in the United States, the terms liberal and progressive are often used interchangeably. These political positions are often treated as if they're synonymous, when in fact they are mutually exclusive, and I'd like to demonstrate to you why that is.
See, I'm evil!
Oh boy.
I'm going to use Wikipedia to define these terms, and where I can't use Wikipedia, I'm going to use the dictionary. I want to use definitions that are not esoteric. I want to use definitions that almost everyone is going to be familiar with.
We haven't even gotten to your definition, and I can already tell you it's a non-starter. The very notion that liberalism is something you can define needs to be challenged. In order to make your point, you need to make very specific claims regarding what both liberalism and progressivism is. But the more specific you make your ideology, the harder it will be for you to find any liberals or progressives who agree with your definition, rendering your arguments pointless at best or blatant straw men at worst. Both liberalism and progressivism pretend themselves to be open ideologies, meaning that those who believe in the ideology are free to explore, challenge, modify, customize, and even discard ideas held within the ideology according to scrutiny. This flexibility in and of itself makes a concise definition a contradiction. Unless you're prepared to go authoritarian and flat out declare that if you do not uphold these principles, you are not a liberal, I don't honestly see where you can go with this.
Almost everything about liberalism comes from the concept of self-ownership, or individualism.
And it might help if you at least presented something coherent. You can't get individualism from self-ownership, and here's why. If I say I own my car, how do I know I own my car? Well, because the state says I do, and I have the documents written by the state to prove it. If a little girl was to say, "This is my doll," her statement only has meaning because her parents gave her the doll. To own anything requires an authority to give it meaning. Remove that authority, and the concept of ownership becomes meaningless. Unless you're prepared to say that you own yourself because the state says you do, I have no idea what you're talking about. A libertarian will say that to deny that you own yourself is to assert that you're owned by someone else, by definition, a slave. If you are not a slave, then you must own yourself. But being a slave is not up to you. The whole point of slavery is the subjugation of freedom. It's the power of the state that recognizes someone else's ownership over you. That same power of the state is needed for you to say that you own yourself. The problem is, to say that you own yourself is to still assert you are property, that you must be owned by someone. And I fail to see how being property lends itself to being an individual. I reject this notion. I am not property. I am a person, and my personhood exists independent of the state. If you place me on a deserted island where there is no state, I am still a person. Place me in a prison where the power of the state is omnipresent, and I still remain a person. My individualism is an emergent property of my autonomy and uniqueness.
And includes, but is not limited to, personal liberty, equality of opportunity, rule of law, economic freedom, which includes access to free markets and laissez-faire trading, freedom of expression, which encompasses freedom of assembly, freedom of the press, freedom of speech, and freedom of thought, and political freedom in a democratic society. If you do not uphold these principles, you are not a liberal.
And you go full authoritarian. Well, I guess we can move on then.
Let us begin with the very root of liberalism, individualism. Individualism is often contrasted with totalitarianism or collectivism. If you do not uphold these principles, you are not a liberal.
I would be quite remiss if I didn't point out that particular example of hypocrisy. I'm going to pause here in order to take on another false dichotomy that Sargon has invoked. The concept of individualism and collectivism are diametrically opposite ideas. Sargon is literally failing to see the forest for the proverbial trees. Should I call it a forest, the trees do not magically disappear into a puff of logic. But Sargon would have us believe that the individual disappears the moment we call them a collective. I argue that individualism and collectivism are in fact nested concepts, with collectives being better called communities, being made up of many individuals, with each individual being part of any number of different communities, be it a religion, a nation, their city, family, and so forth. I agree that our individualism is self-evident, but it's equally self-evident that we are all part of a much larger community. Our powers of language and social bonding indicate that we are genetically hardwired to form groups and to join collectives. A modern society and the sheer number of us trying to live on this planet makes collectives a necessity for survival. From this perspective, the notion of our individualism or collectivism not only becomes meaningless, but in and of itself becomes a form of oppression. Only certain communities or collectives that share the dogma of individualism are permitted to exist. All other communities are dealt with. I embrace the idea that we do not have to choose. We can be a part of the collective while still retaining our individualism. In fact, personal liberty demands this freedom.
Possibly the most important principle of individualism is personal liberty.
I am cutting this down significantly. His definitions don't actually lend much to his argument anyway.
Which is why we need to talk about the Black Lives Matter movement and Bernie Sanders. Black Lives Matter is an activist movement that began in July 2013 after the acquittal of George Zimmerman after shooting black teenager Trayvon Martin. It's difficult to accurately characterize disparate hashtag movements, but I think it's safe to say that the Black Lives Matter activists are all very concerned with perceived police brutality against African Americans in the United States.
Perceived police brutality? I think that's been pretty well established.
Although not originally a progressive movement, the Black Lives Matter movement fit very neatly in with progressive principles and gained almost universal acceptance with progressives, and is now one of the causes that they champion.
Okay, I don't really have a problem with that. But are you implying that liberalism does not accept this? Real or imagined, police brutality would definitely have a profound impact on personal liberty.
On August the 8th, 2015, Democratic presidential candidate Bernie Sanders hosted a campaign rally in Seattle where he attempted to give a speech.
Thank you, Seattle, for being one of the most progressive cities in the United States of America.
Barely had these words come out of his mouth when Black Lives Matter activists led by this particular woman climbed onto the stage and interrupted his speech. They demanded that Sanders relinquish his platform so that these activists could speak instead of him, at his rally, during his presidential campaign, or the event would be shut down. Of course, now progressives have to explain to everyone exactly why the Black Lives Matter movement is opposed to Bernie Sanders.
Why does progressivism have to explain anything here? I find it interesting that you're demanding an explanation from a political ideology, which is nothing more than a concept and having no agency of its own, while ignoring the actions of autonomous individuals who actually stormed the stage. At the end of the day, all you can really say is that these women stormed the stage at a Bernie Sanders event. Anything else is simply the product of your imagination. It's absurd to argue that they did what they did in order to advance some kind of nefarious progressive agenda.
So after being interrupted in Phoenix, Sanders said, "I've spent 50 years of my life fighting for civil rights. If you don't want me to be here, that's okay." Note the language that Sanders is using. He's talking about himself as an individual. But the progressive explanation for this is entirely collectivist, and so they end up talking past each other. White progressives can often ignore issues that disproportionately affect people of colour. As progressives, they think of themselves as defenders of people of colour and other marginalised groups, so when they're challenged on their anti-racist bona fides by activists of colour, they tend to react with disbelief, defensiveness, or outright hostility. None of this is speaking to the concerns of the individuals within the crowd. Hell, some of them even shouted out what their problems were.
How dare she call me a racist? I won't pen.
How dare she call me a racist? Not how dare black people call white people racists. We are dealing with a liberal in the crowd there.
So your argument here is that progressives are bad because they use the plural form of words, while liberals are good because they use the singular form. I haven't seen anything that moronic since the Ban Bossy campaign. Well, it's a good news, bad news kind of deal. The good news is the dry cleaner vouched for you. The bad news is the machine ate your cloak of despair. It got tangled up in someone's halo and... oh, nuts. This is the third time this month my client got killed before they could pay me. I'd better move fast before Flatfoot catches wind of this. Open up in there! We got you dead to rights this time, code name! Curse my procrastinating monologues.